They excluded me from Dad's funeral, saying I was too unstable to be around family during their grief. Then they called me selfish for inheriting his entire $3.2 million estate. The same estate they'd been circling like vultures for years, never knowing Dad had been quietly documenting every cruel thing they'd said about his combat veteran daughter. They excluded me from Dad's funeral, saying I was too unstable to be around family during their grief. Then they called me selfish for inheriting his entire $3.2 million estate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The same estate they'd been circling like vultures for years, never knowing Dad had been quietly documenting every cruel thing they'd said about his combat veteran daughter. But the dismissal had started long before Dad's death, long before I came home from Afghanistan with invisible wounds they refused to understand. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'd been the family disappointment since the day I enlisted in the Army at 18 instead of following my siblings to college. While my brother Jake pursued his MBA and my sister Amanda studied law, I was learning how to disarm IEDs in Kandahar province and trying to keep my squad alive through 3 tours of combat. The Hartwell family, Dad had kept his name when he married Mom, had always valued traditional success, degrees, corporate jobs, suburban houses, and social status. Military service didn't fit their narrative of achievement, especially when it came with complications they didn't want to acknowledge. When I came home in 2019 with a Purple Heart, chronic pain from shrapnel injuries, and PTSD that made large family gatherings feel like navigating a minefield, they treated my struggles like a personal failing rather than the cost of serving my country. Sarah just needs to get over it, my mother would tell relatives when I missed family events. She's always been dramatic. Dramatic. That's what they called the panic attacks that left me gasping for breath in crowded restaurants. That's what they called the nightmares that jolted me awake at 3 a.m., screaming names of soldiers who didn't make it home. That's what they called my inability to tolerate fireworks on 4th of July, because the sound sent me diving for cover behind parked cars. Jake, now a successful investment banker in Portland, would roll his eyes whenever Dad mentioned my military service. She chose that life, he'd say. Nobody forced her to play soldier. Amanda, the corporate lawyer with her perfect house in Marin County, was more subtle but equally dismissive. Of course we support our veterans, she'd tell her friends, but Sarah has had years to adjust. At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own mental health. They never asked about the convoy that hit the IED. They never wanted to hear about the medic I tried to save while my own blood soaked into the Afghan dirt. They never inquired about the 11 months of physical therapy or the ongoing treatment for traumatic brain injury. To them, I was just the sister who couldn't hold down a regular job, who lived alone in a small apartment in Vallejo, who showed up to family events looking uncomfortable and left early. I was the one who made holidays awkward with my issues and my inability to just move on. The cruelest moments came during Dad's illness. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer last year, I rearranged my entire life to help with his care, driving him to chemotherapy appointments, staying overnight when he was in pain, researching treatment options that might buy him more time. But at family meetings about his care, Jake and Amanda treated me like a child. They discussed medical decisions without consulting me, made plans around my schedule without asking, and spoke about Dad's condition as if I wasn't qualified to understand the gravity of the situation. "This is complicated, Sarah," Amanda would say when I questioned their choices. "Maybe it's better if Jake and I handle the important decisions." The important decisions. Because apparently, a combat veteran who'd made life and death choices under fire couldn't be trusted to help navigate her own father's medical care. Dad saw it all. He watched them dismiss me, minimize my contributions, and treat my service-related struggles as inconveniences. What they didn't know was that he was taking careful notes. The breaking point came 3 days after Dad died, when I arrived at the funeral home to help with arrangements and found Jake and Amanda already there, sitting across from the funeral director with a folder full of decisions they'd made without me. "Sarah," Amanda looked up with that practiced lawyer expression that meant she was about to deliver bad news with clinical precision. "We need to talk." I sat down, still numb from losing the one person in my family who had understood what I'd been through. Dad had been my anchor, the the one who never made me feel broken or dramatic for struggling with invisible wounds. "We've been discussing the funeral arrangements," Jake said, his voice carrying the same tone he probably used in board meetings. "And we think it would be best if you stepped back from the public aspects of the service." I stared at him, not immediately understanding what he meant. Stepped back how? Amanda leaned forward, her expression carefully composed. "Sarah, we're worried about your stability during this emotional time. You've been under a lot of stress with Dad's illness, and we're concerned that the pressure of a large funeral service might be triggering for you." Triggering. They were using my PTSD against me, weaponizing my mental health struggles to exclude me from my own father's funeral. "You're concerned about me embarrassing you," I said quietly, the truth settling over me like ice water. "That's not what this is about," Jake insisted, but his eyes betrayed him. "This is about Dad having the dignified service he deserves. He was a respected businessman in this community. There will be hundreds of people there, colleagues, clients, civic leaders. We can't risk any incidents. As if my grief might manifest as some kind of public breakdown that would reflect poorly on the family reputation." "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Amanda consulted her notes like she was reading terms of a legal settlement. "We think you should attend the private family viewing the night before, say your goodbyes then, and skip the actual funeral service. That way you can grieve privately without the stress of being around so many people." The funeral director, Mr. Patterson, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been handling services for 30 years and had clearly never witnessed family members banning each other from funerals. "This is my father's funeral," I said, my training helping me maintain control even as my world collapsed around me. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I think I can handle a funeral service." "That's exactly the problem," Jake snapped, his composure finally cracking. "Everything is always about your military service. Dad's dead, Sarah. This isn't about you and your war stories. This is about giving him a proper goodbye without worrying about whether you're going to have a panic attack during the eulogy." The words hit me like shrapnel. My own brother had just reduced 3 years of combat service and the trauma that came with it to war stories that might inconvenience Dad's funeral. "Who's giving the eulogy?" I asked. "I am," Amanda said. "Jake and I will handle all the speaking responsibilities. We don't want to put any additional pressure on you." They divided up my father's funeral like a business merger, assigning roles and responsibilities while excluding the daughter who'd spent the last year of his life holding his hand through chemotherapy. And if I refused to accept this arrangement? The silence stretched between us like a battlefield. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice cold and final. "Then we'll have security escort you out. Dad wouldn't want his funeral turned into a scene because you couldn't control yourself." I looked at Mr. Patterson, who was staring at his hands, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Then I looked back at my siblings, these people who shared my blood but had never understood my heart. "I understand," I said quietly. "You've made your position clear." I stood up and walked out, leaving them to plan a funeral that would honor everything about Dad except the daughter who'd loved him most. I spent the day of Dad's funeral sitting alone in Golden Gate Park, wearing the black dress I'd bought specifically for saying goodbye to the man who had never once made me feel like a burden or a disappointment. While Jake delivered his carefully crafted eulogy to hundreds of mourners, I sat on a bench overlooking the Japanese tea garden, reading the last letter Dad had written to me. He'd given it to me 3 weeks before he died, with instructions not to open it until after the funeral. "My dearest Sarah," it began in his familiar handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I suspect your siblings have found some way to make this difficult time even harder for you. I want you to know that I see everything: how they treat you, how they minimize your service, how they act as if your struggles make you less valuable rather than more precious." The letter continued for 3 pages, but one paragraph made me fold the paper carefully and put it away for later. "I've made arrangements that will surprise everyone, especially Jake and Amanda. They think they understand my values, but they've confused financial success with character. You are the only one of my children who truly understands sacrifice, service, and what it means to give more than you take. Everything will make sense soon." That evening, I drove to the funeral home for the private viewing they'd grudgingly allowed me to attend. The parking lot was empty, except for the funeral director's car. Jake and Amanda had scheduled their final goodbye for the morning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, making it clear that even this moment couldn't be shared. I spent an hour with Dad, talking to him the way I had during his final weeks, when pain medication made real conversation impossible. I told him about the new job I'd started at the Veterans Administration, helping other combat veterans navigate their disability claims. I told him about the small apartment I'd finally felt ready to call home, and the therapy group that was helping me understand that healing wasn't linear. "I'm doing okay, Dad," I whispered, adjusting the American flag pin on his lapel, a detail I was certain Jake and Amanda had overlooked. "I'm not the broken soldier they think I am. I'm just someone who saw too much and came home different." The next morning, I didn't attend the funeral service. Instead, I drove to the VA hospital where I volunteered, spending the day helping elderly veterans fill out paperwork and listening to their stories. These men and women understood what my family never could, that coming home from war wasn't the end of service, it was just a different kind of mission. Around noon, my phone started buzzing with messages I didn't read, then voicemails I didn't listen to. By evening, both Jake and Amanda had called 12 times each. I finally answered when Amanda called for the 13th time. "Sarah, where the hell are you?" she demanded, her lawyer composure completely shattered. "We need to talk, now." "I'm at home. What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" Her voice climbed to a pitch I'd never heard before. "What's wrong is that Dad's lawyer just read his will to us, and apparently, you need to be present for the reading tomorrow morning. Something about the primary beneficiary having to acknowledge receipt in person." Primary beneficiary. The words didn't immediately register. "I don't understand," I said. "Neither do we," Jake's voice came through on speakerphone. "But we need you at Morrison, Klein & Associates at 10 a.m. tomorrow. The lawyer said the will can't be executed without your signature." I hung up, staring at my phone and thinking about Dad's letter, about his mention of arrangements that would surprise everyone. For the first time since his death, I smiled. What Jake and Amanda didn't know, as they spent the night frantically trying to understand why I was suddenly central to Dad's will, was that my relationship with him had deepened significantly during his final year in ways they'd never witnessed. While they visited on weekends and holidays, making dutiful appearances that lasted exactly long enough to avoid guilt, I had been Dad's daily companion through his cancer journey. Not just for doctor visits and practical care, but for the conversations that happened at 2 a.m., when pain kept him awake and fear made him need to talk. During those long nights, Dad had told me things he'd never shared with Jake or Amanda. He talked about his own father, a World War II veteran who'd come home from the Pacific with what they called shell shock in those days, and how the family had treated him like a broken man instead of a hero. He talked about the guilt he'd carried for decades, watching me struggle with PTSD while remembering how his own family had failed his father. "I won't make that mistake," he'd whispered one night after a particularly difficult chemo session. "I see who you really are, Sarah. I see the strength it takes to get up every day and fight a war that nobody else understands." What my siblings also didn't know was that Dad had been quietly researching my military service, reading after-action reports I'd never shared, learning about the specific engagements I'd been involved in. He discovered details about my Purple Heart citation that I'd never told the family, how I'd stayed conscious long enough after the IED blast to coordinate medical evacuation for 3 wounded soldiers before allowing myself to be treated. He'd also been tracking my recovery and the work I'd started doing with other veterans. The job at the VA that my family dismissed as just another government position was actually a specialized role, helping combat veterans with complex PTSD cases. I'd been specifically recruited because of my combination of combat experience and my own successful navigation of the VA disability system. But the most significant thing Jake and Amanda didn't understand was that Dad had been documenting their treatment of me for months, not out of spite, but out of a growing realization that his other children had inherited his business acumen but none of his values. During his illness, he'd watched Jake visit precisely twice per month, always with his phone out, always cutting visits short for important calls. He'd observed Amanda's clinical approach to his care, treating his cancer like a legal case to be managed efficiently rather than a father's pain to be comforted. Most damaging to their cause, he'd overheard their conversations about his estate, the hushed discussions in hospital hallways about property values and inheritance taxes, the casual mentions of how they'd divide his assets when the time comes, the assumptions they'd made about my inability to handle financial responsibility because of my mental health struggles. Dad had been a successful businessman for 40 years. He understood people, and he understood what motivated them. What he'd observed in his final months had convinced him that Jake and Amanda saw his death primarily as a financial opportunity, while I saw it as the loss of the one person who'd truly understood my journey. 3 weeks before he died, Dad had called his lawyer, Robert Morrison, and completely rewritten his will. Not out of anger, but out of clarity about which of his children had actually inherited his most important values: service, sacrifice, and genuine care for others. The new will contained provisions that Jake and Amanda couldn't have imagined because they'd never bothered to understand either Dad's true priorities or my actual capabilities. Tomorrow morning, they would learn that their assumptions about both of us had been catastrophically wrong. I arrived at Morrison, Klein & Associates at exactly 10 a.m., wearing the same black dress I'd worn to the private viewing and carrying Dad's final letter in my purse like a talisman. The law firm occupied the top floor of a downtown San Francisco high-rise, all marble surfaces and mahogany furniture designed to impress clients with old money and older traditions. I'd been here once before, years ago, when Dad had updated his will after Mom's death. Jake and Amanda were already seated in the conference room when I walked in, their expressions ranging from confused to irritated. Jake wore his most expensive suit, the one he saved for important business meetings. Amanda had chosen her courtroom armor, a sharp blazer that said she was ready for battle. They'd positioned themselves on one side of the polished conference table like opposing counsel, leaving me to sit alone on the other side. The message was clear. Even at our father's will reading, it was still them against me. "Sarah," Jake nodded curtly. "Glad you could make it." Amanda didn't bother with pleasantries. "Do you have any idea what this is about? The lawyer won't tell us anything except that your presence is required for the reading." I shook my head, though Dad's letter had given me hints that something significant was coming. "I know as much as you do." That was technically true, though the weight of Dad's final message in my purse suggested I might be less surprised than they expected. Robert Morrison entered the room carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the expression of a man who'd been practicing law long enough to recognize family drama when he saw it. He'd known Dad for 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, and I'll try to make this as straightforward as possible." Jake leaned forward. "Before we begin, can you explain why Sarah's presence was specifically required? We were under the impression that Dad's estate was fairly straightforward." Mr. Morrison opened the folder and withdrew a document that looked far more complex than the simple will I remembered from years earlier. "Your father made significant changes to his estate planning in the final weeks of his life. These changes require acknowledgement from the primary beneficiary." "Primary beneficiary?" Amanda's voice carried the sharp edge it took on when she sensed something going wrong in a legal proceeding. "I thought the estate was being divided equally among the 3 children." "That was the previous will," Mr. Morrison replied carefully. "Your father executed a new will 3 weeks before his death, and the distribution is different." The room fell silent except for the distant hum of San Francisco traffic 20 floors below. I could see the wheels turning in my siblings' minds, calculating possibilities, trying to understand what different might mean. Jake's business instincts kicked in first. Different? How? Are we talking about unequal distribution? Special provisions? Mr. Morrison consulted his notes. "Perhaps it would be best if I simply read the relevant sections. Your father was very specific about how he wanted this information conveyed." Amanda's hands were already clenched, her lawyer training telling her that careful language from opposing counsel usually meant bad news for her client. "Before I begin," Mr. Morrison continued, I should mention that your father included several personal letters to be distributed after the will reading. He wanted you to understand not just what he decided, but why he decided it. I thought about the letter already in my purse, wondering what else Dad had written, what other truths he decided to share, after a lifetime of watching family dynamics he'd finally chosen not to tolerate. The reading that was about to begin would change everything between us forever. Mr. Morrison adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat with the gravity of a man about to detonate a carefully placed explosive. I'll begin with the primary bequest section, he said, his voice taking on the formal tone lawyers use when delivering information that will fundamentally alter people's lives. To my daughter Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, who alone among my children understands the meaning of sacrifice and service, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to the family residence at 1247 Pacific Heights Boulevard, valued at approximately $2.1 million. My investment portfolio managed by Hartwell Capital Management, currently valued at $847,000. My business interests in Hartwell Construction Group, valued at The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Jake's face had gone ashen. Amanda looked as if she'd been physically struck. They sat frozen, staring at Mr. Morrison as if he might suddenly announce this was some kind of elaborate mistake. "I'm sorry," Amanda finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say the entirety?" Mr. Morrison nodded grimly. "Your father was very specific. The entire estate goes to Sarah, with one exception, which I'll address momentarily." "This can't be right." Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Dad would never. There has to be some mistake. Sarah's been barely functional since she got back from Afghanistan. She can't handle this kind of responsibility." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt the familiar sting of having my mental health used as a weapon against me. Mr. Morrison consulted his notes. Your father anticipated this reaction. He included specific language addressing concerns about Sarah's capacity to manage the inheritance. Would you like me to read that section? Yes, Amanda said sharply, her lawyer instincts taking over. Read all of it. Mr. Morrison turned the page. Your father wrote, "Some may question Sarah's ability to handle this responsibility due to her struggles with PTSD and related challenges. To address these concerns directly, Sarah has successfully managed her own finances, maintained steady employment, and navigated complex medical and legal systems to secure her VA benefits. More importantly, she has demonstrated the moral character and genuine care for others that I had hoped to instill in all my children." Jake was pacing now, his business mind racing through implications. What about the business? The properties? Sarah doesn't know anything about real estate or construction management. Actually, Mr. Morrison said, consulting another document, your father addressed that as well. He included detailed provisions for professional management of business assets, with Sarah maintaining ownership while experienced managers handled day-to-day operations. He seemed quite confident in her ability to learn and adapt. Amanda leaned forward, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone I recognized from her courtroom experience. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask directly, what provisions were made for Jake and myself? Surely there's something. Mr. Morrison's expression softened slightly. Your father left each of you a single item. Jake, you inherit his collection of business books and his desk from the home office. Amanda, you receive his law school textbooks and his briefcase. The insult was surgical in its precision. Dad had left them the symbols of the achievements they'd always valued above everything else, while leaving his actual wealth to the daughter they dismissed as broken. This is insane, Jake exploded. Sarah lives in a studio apartment and works for the government. She doesn't need millions of dollars. We have families, mortgages, responsibilities. Which brings me to the final section, Mr. Morrison interrupted. Your father included a personal message to be read aloud. Would you like to hear it? None of us answered, but he began reading anyway. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and began reading Dad's final message in a voice that carried 30 years of legal gravitas. To Jake and Amanda, my children who have achieved so much by society's standards but have forgotten the values I tried to teach them. I am leaving my estate to Sarah not as punishment, but as recognition of who she truly is versus who you have chosen to become. Jake slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. We're being punished for being successful? Mr. Morrison continued reading, his voice steady and implacable. Jake, you have visited me exactly 24 times in the past year of my illness. I counted. Each visit lasted an average of 37 minutes, and you checked your phone for work messages an average of 8 times per visit. You discussed my health for approximately 6 minutes total across all visits, spending the remainder of our time together talking about your business deals and investment strategies. Jake's face flushed red. I was trying to distract him from his illness. Amanda, Mr. Morrison continued, you approached my cancer diagnosis like a legal case to be managed efficiently. You researched treatment options not to comfort me, but to minimize disruption to your schedule. When I asked you to stay with me during my first chemotherapy session, you sent me a text message explaining that you had a deposition that was more time-sensitive than sitting in a waiting room. Amanda's professional composure was cracking. We were trying to be practical. Someone had to handle the logistics while Sarah was being emotional about everything. Mr. Morrison turned the page. Sarah, by contrast, rearranged her entire life to care for me. She attended 47 medical appointments with me over 11 months. She slept on the uncomfortable chair in my hospital room during both emergency admissions. She researched experimental treatments at 2 a.m. and called doctors in other states to discuss options. She held my hand through chemotherapy sessions that lasted 8 hours, never once checking her phone or acting like she had somewhere more important to be. The room was silent, except for the sound of Amanda's rapid breathing. But more than the practical care, Dad's letter continued, Sarah was the only one who saw me as a person rather than a problem to be solved. She listened to my stories about my own father's war trauma. She understood that my fear wasn't just about dying, but about dying without making peace with the ways I'd failed her when she came home from Afghanistan struggling with her own invisible wounds. I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes, remembering those late-night conversations when Dad had apologized for not understanding PTSD, for not defending me against family members who called my struggles dramatic. Mr. Morrison's voice softened as he read the final paragraph. Sarah has spent the last year proving something that Jake and Amanda seem incapable of understanding, that true wealth isn't measured in salary figures or property values, but in the willingness to sacrifice your own comfort for someone else's well-being. She has shown me more genuine love and care in 11 months than her siblings have shown in 11 years. The silence stretched like a chasm between us. Finally, Jake found his voice. So we're being disinherited because we have demanding careers? Because we couldn't drop everything to play nurse? You're being disinherited, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading began. Because Dad finally understood the difference between having children and raising human beings with character. Amanda's mask of professional control finally shattered. This is unbelievable. You've manipulated a dying man into cutting out his own family. I manipulated him, I replied, by showing up. Mr. Morrison closed the file. There's one more thing. Your father included documentation to support his decisions. Copies of text messages, voice recordings, and written records of family interactions over the past year. He wanted to ensure his reasoning was clear and legally sound. Dad had been building a case, documenting everything, protecting his final decision from the legal challenges he knew were coming. What happened next revealed the true depth of my family's character in ways that even Dad's carefully documented observations hadn't fully captured. Mr. Morrison, Amanda's voice had taken on the cold precision she used when cross-examining hostile witnesses. I need to understand the legal implications here. Is this will contestable? Are there grounds for challenging my father's mental capacity at the time of signing? The question hung in the air like an accusation. My sister, the corporate lawyer, was already strategizing how to prove our dying father had been mentally incompetent when he chose to leave his estate to the daughter who'd cared for him. Mr. Morrison's expression hardened. Mrs. Patterson, I can assure you that your father was completely lucid when he executed this will. In fact, he anticipated this exact question. Would you like me to share the psychiatric evaluation he requested? Jake looked up sharply. Psychiatric evaluation? Your father underwent a comprehensive mental competency assessment 3 weeks before his death, specifically to ensure that no one could challenge this will on grounds of diminished capacity. Dr. Elizabeth Chen from UCSF Medical Center conducted extensive cognitive testing. Her report concludes that your father demonstrated complete mental clarity and decision-making capacity. Amanda's face had gone pale, but she pressed on. What about undue influence? Sarah was his primary caregiver during a vulnerable time. She had unprecedented access and opportunity to manipulate his decisions. I stared at my sister, watching her attempt to criminalize the fact that I'd been present for our father's final months while she'd been managing his death like a business transaction. Mr. Morrison pulled out another document. Your father also anticipated that accusation. He arranged for supervised will signings with 2 independent witnesses, neither of whom knew Sarah personally. Additionally, he recorded a video statement explaining his reasoning, which I have here if you'd like to view it. We want to see it, Jake demanded. Mr. Morrison set up a laptop and pressed play. Dad's face appeared on screen, gaunt from chemotherapy, but with eyes that were completely clear and determined. If you're watching this, Dad's recorded voice filled the conference room, it means Jake and Amanda are questioning my mental state rather than examining their own behavior. Let me be absolutely clear. I am of sound mind, and this decision comes from 40 years of observing my children's character. The recording continued for 12 minutes. Dad methodically explained his reasoning, citing specific examples of Jake's and Amanda's behavior during his illness. He mentioned Jake's comment about getting this over with quickly so we can settle the estate. He referenced Amanda's suggestion that they, quote, put him in hospice care to avoid the daily management burden. Most damaging was his recounting of a conversation he'd overheard between them in the hospital hallway, where they discussed selling the family house immediately after his death and splitting the proceeds, never once considering that I might want to preserve the home where I'd grown up. Sarah, Dad's voice continued, has shown me what real love looks like. Not the obligatory love of duty, but the sacrificial love of choice. She has given up her own comfort to ease my suffering, and she has treated my final months as precious time rather than an inconvenience to be managed. When the video ended, the room was silent except for the hum of the laptop's cooling fan. Jake's voice was barely controlled. So you're telling us that our own father has essentially accused us of being greedy and uncaring in a legal document that will be part of public record? Your father, Mr. Morrison replied carefully, has created an unassailable legal record of his final wishes and the reasoning behind them. Amanda was already thinking like a lawyer. This doesn't end here. We'll challenge this will on every possible ground. Emotional manipulation, elder abuse, anything that applies. And that, I said quietly, is exactly why Dad made sure to document everything. The meeting ended with Jake and Amanda storming out, already making phone calls to other lawyers about contesting the will. But before they left, Amanda turned back one final time, her face twisted with rage and something that might have been desperation. You know what this makes you, Sarah? Selfish. Completely selfish. You've stolen our inheritance by playing the victim card. Dad felt sorry for you because of your PTSD drama, and you manipulated that guilt into millions of dollars. The accusation hit me like incoming fire, but this time I was ready for it. Selfish, I repeated, letting the words settle between us. I'm selfish for spending a year caring for our dying father while you visited twice a month for 37 minutes each time? Jake stepped forward, his business instincts kicking in. Sarah, be reasonable. You don't need this money. You live simply, you don't have a family to support. We have mortgages, kids' college funds, real financial responsibilities. What you have, I said quietly, are choices. You chose expensive houses and private schools and luxury cars. I chose to serve my country and then serve our father. Now you want me to subsidize your lifestyle choices, because Dad recognized the difference. Amanda's voice took on the pleading tone she probably used with juries when her case was weak. We're family, Sarah. This money should be shared. It's what Dad would have really wanted if he hadn't been influenced by grief and guilt. This was my moment of choice. I could take the easy path, split the inheritance, buy peace with my siblings by rewarding their neglect and validating their assumptions about my character. But I thought about Dad's letter, about his years of watching them treat my service and my struggles as character flaws, rather than evidence of strength. I thought about the 11 months I'd spent holding his hand through chemo while they managed his dying like a business project. Most importantly, I thought about what this money could actually accomplish in the right hands. "You want to know what I'm going to do with Dad's estate?" I asked, pulling out my phone and showing them a document I'd been working on for weeks, ever since Dad's letter had hinted at what was coming. "I'm establishing the James Hartwell Foundation for Combat Veterans. The house will become a transitional living facility for homeless veterans. The investment portfolio will fund PTSD treatment programs that the VA can't afford. The business assets will be liquidated to create an emergency fund for veterans facing financial crisis." Jake's mouth fell open. "You're giving it all away?" "I'm using it the way Dad would have wanted, to help people who've sacrificed for others, people who come home from war, to families that don't understand their struggles, people who need someone to fight for them the way Dad fought for me." Amanda looked stunned. "Sarah, that's millions of dollars. You could set yourself up for life." "I already am set up for life," I replied. "I have a job I love helping other veterans. I have a small apartment that feels like home. I have friends who understand my journey. What I don't need is money I didn't earn, especially money that would come with the constant reminder that my own siblings thought I stole it from them." The foundation paperwork was already drawn up, waiting only for the inheritance to clear probate. Dad's lawyer had helped me prepare it during his final weeks, understanding exactly what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. "You're insane," Jake said finally. "Completely insane." "Maybe," I agreed, "but I'm insane in a way that would make Dad proud." They left without another word, and I sat alone in the conference room, thinking about the difference between inheriting money and inheriting values. 1 year later, I stood in the living room of what had once been Dad's house and was now the James Hartwell Transitional Home for Combat Veterans, watching 8 former soldiers share dinner around the mahogany table where my family had once gathered for holidays. The legal challenge Jake and Amanda had threatened never materialized. After 2 months of consultations with expensive lawyers, they'd been told the same thing Dad's documentation had already made clear. The will was unassailable, his mental capacity unquestionable, and their chances of success essentially zero. They'd stopped speaking to me entirely after the foundation launched, which turned out to be a gift I hadn't expected. The silence left space for relationships that actually mattered. The veterans I worked with, the volunteers who believed in our mission, the friends who measured worth in character rather than bank statements. Marcus Rodriguez, a Marine who'd lost his leg in Fallujah, was now the house manager. Sarah Kim, an Air Force veteran struggling with PTSD from her deployment in Iraq, had become our peer counselor. Each of the residents had a story similar to mine: service, sacrifice, and families who didn't understand the cost of either. "Sarah," Marcus called from the kitchen, "dinner's ready. You staying tonight?" I smiled, thinking about my own small apartment across town where I'd chosen to remain, despite now having the resources to live anywhere. Wouldn't miss it. The dining room that had once showcased my mother's china and my family's careful social hierarchies now buzzed with conversations about job interviews, therapy appointments, and small victories in the daily battle of rebuilding civilian lives. During dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Saw the news story about your foundation in the Chronicle. The family house looks different." Different was an understatement. Dad's study had become a computer lab where veterans worked on resumes and college applications. The formal living room was now a group therapy space. The wine cellar had been converted into a workshop where residents learned job skills and worked on projects that gave them purpose. But the most important change was invisible. The house had become a place where people felt valued for who they were rather than dismissed for who they weren't. After dinner, I walked out to the garden where Dad and I had spent countless hours during his final months. A small memorial stone bore his name and his favorite quote: "True wealth is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you give away." My phone rang, Jake calling for the first time since the will reading. "Sarah." His voice was different, quieter somehow. "I wanted you to know that my daughter saw the news story about your foundation. She asked me why Uncle Sarah was helping other soldiers, and why I wasn't." I waited, letting him find his words. I told her it was complicated, but she said it seemed pretty simple to her. She said you were being kind and I was being mean. He paused. 8-year-olds have a way of cutting through adult rationalizations. Kids usually see things clearly, I agreed. The foundation, what you've built there. Dad would be proud. For the first time in over a year, Jake's voice carried something other than anger or calculation. It carried recognition. He already was proud, I said. He just needed to see who would carry on his values and who would abandon them. After we hung up, I sat in Dad's garden thinking about inheritance. Not the kind measured in dollars, but the kind measured in choices made when no one is watching, in hands extended to people who can offer nothing in return. The money had been Dad's final gift, but the greater inheritance was the understanding that worth isn't something you accumulate. It's something you demonstrate, one choice at a time, one life at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.